My husband Terrence died in October. 4 months later, I received a notice from the Internal Revenue Service saying that a federal tax lien had been recorded against him for unpaid taxes from 3 years before his death, that the lien attached to all property he owned, and that I should contact them to discuss the status of the lien against the property at our address on Birchwood Lane in Delaware, Ohio. The notice said the outstanding amount was $62,000. It said I should respond within 30 days. I am a high school chemistry teacher. I have taught chemistry for 17 years, and the first thing chemistry teaches you is that the identity of the substance you are working with determines everything about how you should work with it. Before you act, you identify. You do not assume. You read the label, you test the sample. You confirm what you are dealing with. When the IRS notice arrived, I did not panic, and I did not call the number I want to describe the evening I spent reading after the IRS notice arrived and about the specific sequence I had followed. In chemistry, when you are presented with an unknown substance, you do not act on the label. You test the substance itself. The label might be wrong. The substance is what it is regardless of the label. The IRS notice was a label that said you owe us money and we have a lien on your house. I had not acted on the label. I had gone to test the substance. The substance was the federal tax lien itself, recorded at the Delaware County Recorder. I had read the lien from the beginning to the end. I had noted what it attached to. Terrence was named as the delinquent taxpayer. His property and rights to property were the claimed subject of the lien. The property on Birchwood Lane was listed as a property subject to the lien. I had then read the original deed for our house. Joint tenants with right of survivorship, both our names. I had then read my own affidavit of surviving joint tenant. I had then spent 2 hours reading 26 U.S.C. 6321 and the case law I could find about federal tax liens and joint tenancy survivorship. The reading had produced a framework. The framework had shown me the answer. I had not called the IRS number on the notice. I had called Emeka in the morning with the framework already in hand. He had confirmed the framework was correct. That confirmation had been the beginning of the process that resolved the matter. The evening reading had made the morning call productive. Read first, call second. I also want to say something about what it means to apply a scientist's habits to a legal situation and about why this approach had been the right one. In my chemistry classroom, I spend a significant amount of time teaching students the difference between a hypothesis and a conclusion, and between a label and a verified composition. The IRS notice had arrived with a claim on it. A claim is a hypothesis. A claim is not a conclusion. A conclusion requires evidence, and the evidence in this case was in the Delaware County Recorder portal and in the text of 26 U.S.C. 6321 and in the federal case law applying the statute to joint tenancy survivorship. I had assembled the evidence before I had accepted the claim. The evidence had not supported the claim. The claim had been wrong. The IRS had a lien against Terrence's interest. Terrence's interest had terminated when he died. The surviving tenant takes from the original deed, not from the deceased tenant. A lien on the deceased tenant's interest cannot reach an interest derived from a different source. This is the scientific answer to a legal question. Establish the source, trace the derivation, determine whether the claim can reach it. I had done this. The answer had been no. I had not paid the IRS. I had filed to discharge the lien. The lien was discharged. The house is mine. The method works. Read the primary source. Verify the claim before you accept the claim. The recorder is the primary source. The statute is the primary source. Read them. The recorder holds the lien. The recorder holds the deed. The recorder holds the discharge. All three are in the Delaware County Recorder portal, searchable by property address at no cost. When you go to the portal and search Birchwood Lane, you find the complete history. The history is public. The history is correct. The history says the house is mine and the lien is discharged. That is what careful reading of primary sources produces. The result is in the record. At the bottom, I went to the Delaware County Recorder's portal and I read the federal tax lien. Then I looked up the original deed to our house. Then I spent the evening reading about federal tax liens and joint tenancy under Ohio law and under federal law. The house on Birchwood Lane had been purchased by Terrence and me 14 years ago. We had taken title as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. The deed was in both our names with that exact language. The deed was recorded at the Delaware County Recorder. When Terrence died, I had filed the Affidavit of Surviving Joint Tenant and a certified copy of the death certificate with the Delaware County Recorder. The auditor's records had been updated to show me as the sole owner of record. What I found in my research was this. Under federal law, a federal tax lien attaches to all property and rights to property belonging to the taxpayer. The critical question when a tax lien is recorded against one joint tenant is what property interest the taxpayer actually held. In a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, each joint tenant holds an undivided interest in the property, but that interest is not a freely alienable separate share in the way that a tenant in common's interest is. Under the specific rule recognized by courts applying federal tax lien law to joint tenancies, the federal tax lien attaches to the taxpayer's interest in the joint tenancy as it existed at the time of the lien. When one joint tenant dies and the surviving joint tenant takes the whole by right of survivorship, the survivorship operation is not a transfer subject to the lien. The surviving joint tenant's full ownership comes from the original deed, not from the deceased tenant, and a lien on the deceased tenant's interest cannot follow into the surviving tenant's complete ownership. The lien had attached to Terrence's joint tenancy interest. That interest had terminated at his death. What I held was not derived from his interest. I held the full property through the survivorship mechanism that had been built into the deed since the day we purchased the house. Before I go on, if this story I want to explain the specific legal distinction that makes the joint tenancy survivorship work against a federal tax lien. Federal law defines what a lien can attach to, all property and rights to property of the taxpayer. But federal law looks to state law to define what property interest the taxpayer actually holds. This means that to understand what the lien attached to, you must first understand the Ohio law of joint tenancy and what interest a joint tenant holds. Under Ohio law, a joint tenant holds an undivided interest in the property with the specific survivorship right built into the original deed. The survivorship right has a specific character. The surviving joint tenant's right to the whole arises from the original deed, not from the deceased tenant. When courts have asked whether a federal lien on a joint tenant's interest can follow the survivorship, the answer has been that it cannot, because the survivorship operates on the original deed directly and does not pass through the deceased tenant's estate or through a transfer from the deceased tenant. A lien follows transfers of property. The survivorship is not a transfer. It is the operation of the original deed. The lien attached to Terrence's interest. His interest terminated when he died. The survivorship operated on the original deed. My full ownership did not pass through his interest. It arose directly from the deed we had both signed 14 years ago. The lien had no path into what I hold, because what I hold did not pass through what the lien attached to. I also want to say something about the specific legal mechanism and why the surviving joint tenant takes free of a lien on the deceased tenant's interest. The key principle is how the surviving tenant derives their ownership. A surviving joint tenant does not inherit from the deceased tenant. This is the critical distinction. The right of survivorship is a right that was established in the original deed at the time the joint tenancy was created. When Terrence and I bought the house on Birchwood Lane and took title as joint tenants with right of survivorship, the survivorship right was established at that moment. My right to take the whole property at Terrence's death existed from the day the deed was recorded. It did not come from Terrence's estate. It did not come from a transfer from Terrence. It came from the original deed and from the survivorship right that deed had established 14 years before Terrence died. A federal tax lien against Terrence could attach to what Terrence held. He held his joint tenancy interest during his lifetime. When he died, that interest terminated. It did not pass to me. It ceased. My full ownership arose from the survivorship right in the original deed, which had never been Terrence's to encumber. The lien had reached Terrence's interest. Terrence's interest had terminated. The lien had nothing left to hold. This is the mechanism. It is precise. It is the same in every joint tenancy case. The source of the surviving tenant's ownership is the original deed, not the deceased tenant, not the estate, the deed. Find the deed. Read the deed. The deed is in the recorder. I also want to note that the IRS had the remedy of acting against Terrence while he was alive. A federal tax lien against a living joint tenant can be enforced against that tenant interest while they live. The IRS can seek to force a partition of the jointly held property and enforce against the debtor-tenant share. This remedy had been available. It had not been pursued. When Terrence died, the interest that could have been partitioned and reached had terminated. The remedy the IRS had not taken while it was available was no longer available after his death. The law is precise about timing. The timing had run against the IRS. The house was mine. Connects with something real in your life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Claudette. I am 44 years old. And this is the story of how a federal tax lien against my late husband Terrence could not follow his joint tenancy interest into my surviving ownership of our home in Delaware, Ohio. And what an attorney named Emeka Obi, who had practiced federal tax lien and property law in Delaware County for 13 years, did with that survivorship deed in the federal district court proceedings. Now let me explain how federal tax I want to say something about Terrence and about his garden in the side yard and about what it means to me now to tend it. The garden had been his project from the second year we were in the house, and it had the specific, organized character of a project built by someone who understood that a garden is a system and that systems work best when they are designed with the whole in mind. He had put the tomatoes and peppers in the beds that got the most afternoon sun. He had put the herbs where they would be accessible from the back door without being in the way of anything else. He had built a compost area at the far corner that fed the beds every spring. The garden was his thinking through his hand space, and he had come back from his travel weeks on Thursday evenings and had often gone directly to the garden before coming inside, as though the garden was the transition between the work life and the home life, and he needed to pass through it to arrive fully. I have kept the garden in the years since his death. I have not changed the design. I have followed the system he built. The tomatoes go in the afternoon sun. The herbs go by the back door. The compost feeds the beds. The system works because he designed it correctly. I follow it because following a correct system is a form of honoring the person who designed it. The garden is still his. I am its custodian. The house is mine. He would have wanted both to be true. I also want to say something about the classroom and about why being a chemistry teacher had meant that I approached the IRS notice the way I did. I teach chemistry to juniors and seniors, and I spend a great deal of the year teaching the discipline of distinguishing between what a substance is labeled and what the substance actually is. A label is an assertion. The substance is the fact. You verify the fact by testing. You do not accept the label as a substitute for verification. The IRS notice had been a label. It had said, "Your husband's federal tax lien attaches to your home." I had not accepted this label as fact. I had gone to verify it. Verification required reading the lien, reading the deed, and reading the statute. I had done all three. The lien had attached to Terrence's joint tenancy interest. The deed had established a survivorship right in my name from the day of purchase. The statute and the case law had established that a lien on a deceased joint tenant's interest cannot follow that interest into the surviving tenant's ownership because the surviving tenant's ownership comes from the original deed and not from the deceased tenant. The label had been wrong. The verification had shown it was wrong. I had then called Emeka and had described the verification. He had confirmed it. The label had been removed from my property. The house is mine and is clear of the lien because I had checked the substance against the label. They had not matched. I had acted on the substance. This is what chemistry teaches. It applies everywhere you read a record. The discipline of reading the primary source is available to everyone. The Delaware County Recorder portal is publicly accessible. The federal statutes are publicly accessible. The case law is available through Google Scholar and other free sources. The instruments that determine your rights are in the public record. Reading them requires only the decision to read them rather than to accept the alarming summary in the letter that arrived. I had made that decision. The decision had led to the right answer. The right answer had protected the house. Make the decision. Read the primary source. Liens interact with joint tenancy and why this interaction matters so much. A federal tax lien under 26 U.S.C. 6321 attaches to all property and rights to property of the person who owes the tax. When the IRS records a notice of federal tax lien, they are asserting that this lien exists against whatever property interest the delinquent taxpayer holds. In a joint tenancy, the taxpayer holds a joint tenancy interest. What is a joint tenancy interest? It is the right to use and possess the property during the joint tenancy's existence, combined with the possibility of becoming the sole owner if the other joint tenant dies first, along with the corresponding possibility of losing all interest if the taxpayer dies first. This second possibility is critical. The joint tenancy interest is not equivalent to owning a fixed share. If the taxpayer dies before the other joint tenant, the taxpayer's interest disappears entirely. The survivorship right belongs to the surviving tenant under the original deed. It is not transferred from the deceased tenant to the survivor. It vests automatically in the survivor through the survivorship mechanism that was created when the original deed was executed. Courts have consistently recognized that a federal tax lien on one joint tenant's interest cannot defeat the survivorship rights of the other joint tenant when the lien holder takes no action to reach the joint tenancy interest before the taxpayer's death. The lien attached to what the taxpayer had. When the taxpayer died, the joint tenancy interest terminated. What it had attached to ceased to exist as a separate interest. The IRS had the right to reach Terrence's interest while he was alive if they had moved to enforce the lien during his lifetime. They had not. He had died. His interest had terminated. The lien had nothing left to attach to. I called Emeka Obi the morning after I had spent the evening reading. I want to say something about what Emeka had done in the federal proceedings and about the precision of his argument structure. The federal tax lien matter had involved not a state court proceeding, but a federal one, which required a different set of filings and a different court framework than a state quiet title action. The relief Emeka had sought was a determination that the federal tax lien did not attach to the property as I now held it and a discharge of the lien from the title. He had submitted the original deed showing the joint tenancy language. He had submitted the affidavit of surviving joint tenant confirming the survivorship vesting. He had submitted the Sixth Circuit precedents establishing that a federal tax lien on a joint tenant's interest does not survive the joint tenant's death into the surviving tenant's full ownership when the lien was not enforced during the tenant's lifetime. He had submitted an analysis demonstrating that the IRS had had the remedy of enforcing the lien against Terrence's joint tenancy interest during his lifetime and had not used it. The argument had been precise and complete. The federal court had agreed with the analysis. The lien had been discharged from the title. The Delaware County Recorder's records had been updated. The title was clean. The substance had been what I had identified it as on the evening of the reading. The attorney had presented the identification formally. The court had confirmed the identification. The lien had nothing to attach to. The house is mine. I also want to say something about what Emeka Obi had said when I described the case to him on that first morning call. He had listened to my summary of the lien, the deed, the statute, and the case law I had found. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "You have read this correctly." He had said, "The joint tenancy survivorship severs the lien's attachment because the surviving tenant derives from the original deed and not from the deceased tenant." He had said, "We need to move quickly to discharge the lien before the IRS takes any further action on the property." He had said, "Have you recorded the affidavit of surviving joint tenant?" I had said yes. I had recorded it the week after Terrence died. He had said, "Good." He had said, "The title shows you as sole owner. That is the foundation from which we file." His analysis in the federal proceeding had been exactly what he had described in the first call. The survivorship right from the original deed, the termination of Terrence's interest at death, the surviving tenant's ownership deriving from the deed and not from Terrence, the lien's inability to reach an interest whose source was independent of the lien debtor. He had filed this argument clearly and precisely. The federal court had confirmed it. The lien had been discharged. Precision in the first call had produced precision in the filing. Precision in the filing had produced the correct result. I had brought him a prepared framework. He had built the formal structure on that framework. Together, we had built the right answer. Emeka Obi had been practicing property and tax law in Delaware County for 13 years, and he had handled several cases involving federal tax liens and joint tenancy questions before mine. He had known the precedents. He had known which federal circuit decisions applied in our district. He had known how to frame the argument in a way that the federal proceeding would follow to the correct conclusion. The combination of my preparation and his expertise had been the right combination. I had brought the facts and the framework. He had brought the procedural knowledge and the formal argument. Together, we had produced the discharge, said you have read this correctly. He said the federal tax lien attached to Terrence's joint tenancy interest. He said that interest terminated at his death through the survivorship mechanism. He said the IRS cannot follow the lien into your surviving ownership because your full ownership derives from the original deed, not from a transfer from Terrence. He said this is established law. He said we need to file to discharge the lien from the title and to obtain a determination that the lien does not attach to the property as you now hold it. He said to act quickly. The IRS's position in the subsequent proceedings was that the lien should be treated as attaching to the value of Terrence's interest in the property as of the date the lien was recorded, and that this value should be collected from the property even after his death. Emeka's response addressed the federal law directly. I want to say something about what it means to maintain separate finances in a marriage and about how this had both created the problem and protected me from a worse one. Terrence and I had maintained largely separate financial accounts. This arrangement had meant that I had not known the details of his tax situation. It had also meant that the IRS lien was against Terrence alone and not against me as a jointly responsible party. If our taxes had been filed jointly and the delinquency had been from a joint return, the situation would have been more complex because I might have had some joint liability. The separate financial arrangements had produced a lien against Terrence individually. A lien against Terrence individually had attached to his individual property interests. His individual property interest in the house had been his joint tenancy share. That share had terminated at his death. The lien on the terminated interest had nothing left to reach. The structure of our finances had thus been part of the protection. The lien was against him, not against me, and the joint tenancy with survivorship had operated to terminate his interest before the lien could be enforced. I am not saying that maintaining separate finances is always the right arrangement. I am saying that in this case, the structure had worked with the law to produce a specific outcome. Understanding how the structure interacts with the law is the work that reading produces. I had read. I had understood. The house is mine. I also want to say something about what the federal lien discharge process had looked like and about what had happened in the proceeding. A federal tax lien under 26 U.S.C. 6321 is a lien that arises automatically when a taxpayer neglects or refuses to pay taxes after demand. It attaches to all property and rights to property belonging to the taxpayer. The key word is belonging. A property interest that no longer belongs to the taxpayer because it has terminated at death is no longer a property of the taxpayer against which the lien can be enforced. The joint tenancy interest had belonged to Terrence during his life. When he died, it had terminated. It had not transferred to me. It had ceased. I had taken the full ownership from the survivorship right in the original deed. This right had been mine since the deed was recorded 14 years before Terrence died. It had never belonged to Terrence. It had been my right in the property, and the lien had attached to his right and not mine. The federal court had followed this analysis and had agreed that the lien could not reach the property as I now held it. The discharge had been recorded with the Delaware County Recorder. The title was clear. The house was mine, and the lien was gone, and the record showed both of these things clearly. The recorder shows the deed. The recorder shows the lien. The recorder shows the discharge. Read them in order. The order tells the story. The story ends with the house clear and mine. That is the story. The discharge of a federal tax lien is recorded with the county recorder after the federal proceeding determines that the lien does not attach to the property as held by the surviving tenant. This recording is the final step that makes the determination visible in the public title record. Until the discharge is recorded, a title search will show the lien as a cloud on the title. After the discharge is recorded, the title is clear. The discharge in my case had been recorded promptly after the federal determination. The Delaware County Recorder Index shows the discharge. The title is clear. The house is mine in the public record as it has been, in fact, since Terrence died. State's Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, which covers Ohio, had addressed the precise question of whether a federal tax lien on a joint tenant's interest survives the joint tenant's death and attaches to the surviving tenant's ownership. The answer from that court and from other circuits was that it does not. The surviving tenant's full ownership arises from the survivorship right in the original deed, not from the deceased tenant. A lien on the deceased tenant's interest cannot attach to an interest that derives from a different source. The IRS had the remedy of enforcing the lien against Terrence's interest while he was alive. That remedy had been available. They had not used it. When he died, the interest the lien had attached to ceased to exist. The lien had nothing to reach. The federal proceedings confirmed that the lien did not attach to the I want to describe what Delaware, Ohio had been as a place and about what returning to the school in the months after Terrence died had been like. Delaware is compact enough that the things that matter in daily life are accessible without the specific distance costs of a large city. The school where I teach is 12 minutes from the house. The farmers market near Ohio Wesleyan runs on Wednesday evenings through the growing season. The hardware store on the main commercial street knows its regular customers. I had lived in Delaware for 9 years when Terrence died, and the accumulated weight of 9 years in a place had produced the specific belonging that comes from being known by the people you encounter regularly. My students and my colleagues and my neighbors had all been present in the months after Terrence died in the ways that people in a place where you are known are present, with the specific attention that familiarity produces. The house on Birchwood Lane was at the center of all of this. It was the place I came home to from the school. It was the place where Terrence's garden was. It was the anchor of the life I had built in Delaware. The IRS lien had threatened to cut that anchor. The law had said the anchor could not be cut. The house is still here. The anchor holds. I am still in Delaware. I am still at the school. 9 years has become 13 years. The maple trees on Birchwood Lane are still producing autumn color. I am still here to see it. I also want to say something about what it means to have been a chemistry teacher in Delaware, Ohio for 17 years, and about what the students I have taught have come to mean to me as a community. Delaware is a small city of about 40,000 people, and Delaware County is one of the fastest-growing counties in Ohio due to its position between Columbus and the suburban developments to the north. The high school where I teach draws students from several different communities, and it has the specific collegial character of a building where teachers and students have been there long enough to know each other across years. I have taught students whose older siblings I also taught. I have received notes from former students who are now in graduate programs in chemistry and biochemistry and who mention what they remember from my classroom. These connections are what 17 years in one place produce. When Terrence died and the IRS lien had threatened the house and with it my place in this community, I had felt the threat acutely because I had understood what losing the house would have meant for my ability to remain in Delaware and to continue what 17 years of work had built. The law had protected the house had protected the community has continued. I am still in Delaware. I am still at the school. The students still come to my classroom. The recorder holds the evidence of why this is still possible. The deed, the discharge, the clear title, the science of reading the record correctly. I want to say one more thing about Delaware, Ohio, and about the specific character of a place that is growing, but that has retained its small city identity despite the growth. The original downtown and the established neighborhoods adjacent to it have maintained their character while the county has expanded outward. Birchwood Lane is in one of the established neighborhoods, and the continuity of that neighborhood has been part of what staying in Delaware has meant. I walk the neighborhood in the evenings. I know the houses and some of the people in them. This is what 14 years in a neighborhood produces. The law had protected my right to remain in it, property as held by me as the surviving joint tenant. The lien was discharged from the title. The Delaware County Recorder's records were updated to show the title clear of the federal tax lien. The house on Birchwood Lane is mine, and it has been free of the lien since the court's determination. I want to say something before I go. I want to say something about the difference between what the IRS notice had claimed and what the underlying instrument had shown, and about why reading the instrument rather than responding to the notice had mattered. The notice had said, "We have a lien on your property." This framing had been designed to produce a response that treated the house as subject to the lien. If I had called the number and had entered into a conversation about payment arrangements or about the lien's validity without first understanding the law, I might have implicitly conceded that the lien attached to my interest. I had not made that concession. I had gone to the primary source. The primary source was the instrument itself and the statute it operated under. The instrument had attached to Terrence's property and rights to property. The statute said property interests were defined by state law. State law said a joint tenancy interest terminated at death. The survivorship vesting was not a transfer from the deceased tenant. The lien had nothing to follow into my ownership. The notice had not been wrong as a matter of the IRS attempting to collect what it was owed. It had been wrong as a matter of whether it had a legal basis to collect from the specific property interest I held. The difference between what the notice claimed and what the law showed had been the entire case. I had found that difference by reading. The reading had been one evening. One evening of reading had protected the house. I also want to say something about what I tell my students when they ask me what I have learned from the experience and about why I have told some of my advanced students this story as an example of applied critical thinking. I tell them that every document is a primary source and that every claim about a document is a secondary source and that the scientific habit is always to prefer the primary source. A letter from the IRS is not the lien itself. It is a letter about the lien. The lien itself is a public record in the county recorder. The letter had summarized the lien in a way that suggested the lien applied to my property. The lien itself, read carefully with the statute and the case law, did not apply to my property as I held it after Terrence's death. The secondary source had been wrong. The primary source had been right. This is always the hierarchy, and it is always the scientific habit to respect the hierarchy. I tell my students that this habit is not only for chemistry. It is for any situation where someone makes a claim about something you can verify. Verify it. Read the primary source. The county recorder is a public primary source. The statutes are public primary sources. They are free to access. They require only the decision to read them rather than accept the summary. I had made that decision. It had saved my home. I tell my students this. Some of them will remember it when they need it. I hope they do. The primary source is there. Go read it. It holds what is actually true. I also want to say that the primary source habit had not come naturally at first. When the IRS notice had arrived, my first instinct had been to call the number and to ask them to explain the situation. I had suppressed that instinct. I had decided to understand the situation before entering any conversation about it. This decision had required discipline. The alarming letter creates a pressure to respond immediately. That pressure is part of how such letters work. Resistance of that pressure is the first step. Go to the record first, then call an attorney. Then, only then, speak to the creditor. By then you know your position. Your position was protected. Know your position, not about the IRS and not about Terrence's unpaid taxes. About the evening I spent reading about federal tax liens and joint tenancy and about what it means to bring a scientific discipline to a legal question. In chemistry, when you receive unexpected information, you go to the primary source. You do not rely on the alarming summary. You read the underlying data. The IRS notice was the alarming summary. The federal tax lien itself, recorded at the Delaware County Recorder, was the underlying data. The statute and the case law were the underlying framework. I had read the underlying data and the underlying framework before I had responded to the alarming summary. This is what chemistry teaches you. The substance is what it is, regardless of what the label says about it. Read the substance, test it, identify it correctly. Then act on what it actually is, not on what it was presented to be. The federal tax lien was a specific legal instrument that had specific legal effects on specific types of property interests. When I identified those effects correctly, I found that the lien did not reach what I held. Identifying correctly had made all the difference. The Delaware County Recorder held the deed and the lien and the subsequent discharge. Read the primary sources. They tell you what you are actually dealing with. Thank you for staying until the end. I want to say something about what happened after the lien was discharged and about what the complete instrument list at the Delaware County Recorder shows now. The original deed from 14 years ago, Terrence and Claudette as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The notice of federal tax lien recorded against Terrence attaching to his property and rights to property. The affidavit of surviving joint tenant filed after Terrence died confirming the survivorship vesting, my name as sole owner of record. The discharge of the federal tax lien recorded after the federal court determination showing the lien had been found not to attach to the property as held by the surviving joint tenant. The four instruments in chronological order. The complete story of the property in the public record, the joint purchase, the lien against the deceased tenant, the survivorship vesting, the discharge of the lien. Anyone who searches the property will see all four. The recorder holds the complete picture. The complete picture shows that the title is clean. A title examiner searching for any future purpose will find the discharge and the court determination and will confirm the clean title. The record is accurate. The record is complete. The record is honest. The house is mine, and the record says so. It will say so for as long as the recorder holds the instruments it has been given, which is to say, permanently. I also want to say something about Terrence and about what I have come to understand about the unpaid taxes in the years since his death. Terrence had been a freelance commercial photographer for 19 years. Freelance work means you pay your own taxes and that the discipline required to set aside the self-employment tax portion and to make the quarterly estimated payments is entirely your own. Some people have this discipline. Some do not. Terrence had had it for most of his career and had lost it in the years when the work had slowed and the income had become irregular in ways that made the quarterly payments feel impossible rather than merely difficult. He had not told me because he had been managing it in the way people manage financial shame, by containing it and hoping that conditions would improve before it became unavoidable. Conditions had not improved. He had died. The IRS had filed the lien. The notice had arrived. I had dealt with it. I am not angry at Terrence for this. I am sad that he had carried it alone and that the carrying had been part of the weight he had carried in those last years. I am grateful that the law had been designed in a way that protected what we had built together from a debt that had been his alone. The law had recognized that a joint tenant's personal debt is theirs and does not transfer to the surviving tenant. This recognition had protected the house. The house holds what we built. The law held the house. Both are still there. I want to say something more about Terrence and photography and about the photographs he left. He had archived his work carefully on external drives organized by year and subject. The drives are still on the shelf in the office. I have gone through some of them. The work is good. The light in his photographs is handled the way I described, not just captured but understood. He had known what he was doing. The financial difficulty that had produced the unpaid taxes had not come from lack of ability. It had come from conditions that had overtaken the ability to manage them. I hold his work as well as his house. Both are evidence of who he was. The law protected both. If this story made you feel something, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose neighbor had recorded a prescriptive easement claim against a strip of her property that she discovered had been interrupted by a fence her father had built, and what the county auditor's satellite map showed about the fence's location relative to the claimed easement path, it is waiting for you in the description below. Click it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. If you receive a federal tax lien notice about a property you held jointly with your spouse as joint tenants with the right of survivorship, search the county recorder portal. Find the original deed. Confirm the joint tenancy language. Confirm your survivorship affidavit has been recorded. Then read the federal tax lien itself. Identify exactly what property interest the lien attached to. A federal tax lien on a joint tenant's interest does not survive the joint tenant's death into the surviving tenant's full ownership when the lien was not enforced during the joint tenant's lifetime. Your survivorship ownership derives from the original deed, not from the deceased tenant. The lien on the deceased tenant's interest cannot follow into an interest that does not derive from that tenant. The recorder holds the deed and the lien. The statute and the case law hold the framework. Read both. The substance is what it is. Identify it correctly. Act on what it actually is. I want to tell you more about Terrence and about who he was and about what the house on Birchwood Lane had meant to us. Terrence had been a regional sales manager for a commercial printing company for 15 years. He had traveled for work most weeks and had come home on Thursday evenings and had been present on weekends in the specific way of a person who understands that the time they have in a place is finite and who treats it accordingly. He had been fully present on the weekends. He had cooked elaborate meals on Saturdays and had watched his cooking shows on Sunday mornings and had spent Sunday afternoons in the garden he had made in the side yard with the specific combination of attention and practical skill that a person who works with his hands for pleasure brings to a weekend project. The house on Birchwood Lane was in a neighborhood on the east side of Delaware, Ohio that had been developed in the early 1980s with the specific suburban residential character of that era. Ranch houses and split levels on lots large enough for the gardens and the two-car. I want to say something about what I tell my chemistry students about the relationship between observation and conclusion, and about how this applies to any situation where you receive alarming information. In chemistry, the most dangerous moment is when you form a conclusion before you have completed your observation. A conclusion formed before the evidence is complete will shape how you treat the remaining evidence and will bias you toward seeing what you expected to see rather than what is actually there. I teach students to observe completely before concluding. Measure everything before you interpret anything. Read all the data before you form the hypothesis. This discipline had protected me in the situation with the IRS lien. I had not formed a conclusion when the notice arrived. The conclusion the notice wanted me to form was, I owe this debt, and I should call and discuss how to pay it. I had not formed that conclusion. I had said, I do not yet know what I am dealing with. I had observed. Read the lien, read the deed, read the statute, read the case law. Only after completing the observation had I formed the conclusion. The conclusion was that the lien had attached to an interest that had terminated at Terrence's death, and that it could not follow the survivorship into my ownership. The conclusion was correct because the observation had been complete. Observe completely, then conclude, then act, in that order. The chemistry classroom and the county recorder portal teach the same discipline. I also want to describe what the Delaware County Recorder's portal shows for my property now and about what the complete chronological instrument history looks like. The recorder portal for Delaware County shows 3 key instruments for the property on Birchwood Lane listed in chronological order. The first is the warranty deed from 14 years ago naming Terrence and me as joint tenants with right of survivorship. This deed established the joint tenancy and the survivorship right, and is the document from which my full ownership derives. The second is the federal tax lien filed by the IRS against Terrence for his unpaid taxes. This lien attached to his joint tenancy interest but could not reach beyond it. The third is the affidavit of surviving joint tenant. VUT had recorded after Terrence died, establishing in the public record that the joint tenancy had terminated and that I was the sole owner. The fourth is the federal court order discharging the lien from my property, recorded with the Delaware County Recorder after the proceeding. 4 instruments. The story of the property told in public records over 14 years. I had read the first 3 the evening after the IRS notice arrived. Emeka had added the 4th and had recorded it with the recorder. The record is now complete. The house is mine. The lien is gone. The record says so clearly. Anyone can search and find this. The recorder holds it. The primary source is there. Go and read it. It says exactly what is true. The complete instrument history at the recorder is also evidence for any future question about the property. If anyone ever searches the Delaware County Recorder portal for the property on Birchwood Lane, they will find the 4 instruments in order, and they will be able to trace the complete story. Joint tenancy established, lien filed, survivorship recorded, lien discharged. The story ends with clear title. The record tells the story to anyone who reads it in order. This is what the public recording system is designed to do. Tell the story of a property to anyone who asks. Read the story in order. Read it yourself. The recorder holds it for you. Garages that were the standard of the period. Birchwood Lane had mature trees because it had been planted in the early years of the development by people who understood that trees took time and who had planted them anyway. The maples along the street were now large enough to make the lane shaded in summer, and the autumn color on the block had the dense layered quality of a neighborhood that had been in place long enough for the landscape to mature. Terrence had loved this about the neighborhood. He had said when we bought the house, the trees are the reason. He had been right. They are still the reason. I want to say something about the tax situation and about what I had known and not known about Terrence's finances. Terrence and I had maintained largely separate financial lives. This was not a decision we had made deliberately at the outset, but a pattern that had developed over the years as each of us managed our own income and expenses, and as we split the household costs through a joint account to which we both contributed. I had known broadly that he had a tax situation from 3 years before his death. He had mentioned it twice in the way he mentioned unresolved problems, briefly, in the context of saying it was being handled, and then not again. I had not pressed for details because I had trusted that it was being handled, and because his finances had been his domain. When the IRS notice arrived after his death, I had understood that it had not been resolved. What I had not known was whether the lien they had recorded would reach the house. That question had been the question I had spent the evening researching. The answer had been that it did not reach the house. The research had produced the right answer because I had read the primary sources carefully. I want to describe the Delaware County Recorder's portal and what it had shown when I searched both the deed and the federal tax lien. The Delaware County Recorder's portal is publicly accessible and searches by owner name return a chronological list of all recorded instruments. The original deed from 14 years ago appeared in the index. Both are names as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The notice of federal tax lien appeared in the index. Terrence named as the delinquent taxpayer, the lien amount, the recording date. My affidavit of surviving joint tenant appeared in the index, filed after Terrence's death, confirming the survivorship vesting. My name as sole owner. I had read all three documents in the order they appeared in the index. The original deed had established the joint tenancy. The lien had attached to Terrence's joint tenancy interest when it was recorded. The survivorship affidavit had confirmed the termination of his interest and the vesting of full ownership in me. Reading the three instruments in chronological order had shown me the complete picture. The complete picture had shown me that the lien had attached to an interest that no longer existed as a separate interest. I had confirmed this with the statute and the case law. The evening's reading had been sufficient to understand the situation before I called Emeka in the morning. I want to say something about Emeka Obi's practice and about what had distinguished him as the right attorney for this situation. Emeka had been recommended by a colleague in the school's science department whose family had dealt with a property matter involving a federal lien after the death of a parent, and who had said that Emeka understood both the federal law and the state property law and how they interacted. This combination, I want to end with the autumn on Birchwood Lane and with what the maples look like in October and with what Terrence had said about them when we were deciding whether to buy the house. He had said, "The trees are the reason." He had meant that the mature maples along the lane were the thing that made the neighborhood what it was, and that everything else about the house was secondary to whether the setting was right. He had said young trees take decades to become what old trees are, and that a neighborhood with old trees is something you cannot build from scratch. You either find it or you do not. We had found it on Birchwood Lane. He had been right that the trees were the reason. I have watched those same maples go through their October color every year for 14 years, and they are one of the consistent good things in the life I have built in Delaware. When the IRS lien had threatened the house, it had threatened my continued presence under those maples in October. The law had protected my continued presence. The joint tenancy with survivorship that Terrence and I had chosen at the closing 14 years ago had protected my continued presence. The reading I had done on the evening the notice arrived had protected my continued presence. The house is mine. The maples are still there. October comes every year, and the color is still what he said it was, the reason. He was right about the trees. He was right about the joint tenancy language. He chose well. The record held his choices. The law confirmed them. I am still here, in October, under the maples. I also want to end with something about the laboratory and about what Terrence had meant to me in the years before the end. He had spent 19 years photographing commercial subjects in Central Ohio and had been good at it. He had had the photographer's specific relationship to light, an understanding of how it behaved and how to use it and how to find it in situations where other people could not see it. He had sometimes come to my classroom at the end of the day when the afternoon light came in at the angle that made the lab benches glow in a specific way, and he had taken photographs there that I have kept. He had understood the lab as a place of careful attention, and he had brought his version of that attention to it. I had brought the same attention to his situation when the IRS notice arrived. I had gone to the primary source. I had read the lien. I had read the deed. I had read the statute. I had seen what was there and what was not there. He had always said that photography and chemistry were the same discipline viewed from different angles. Both required you to look at what was actually there rather than what you expected to see. I had looked at what was actually in the records. The records had shown that the lien had nothing left to hold. The house was mine. I am still in it. His photographs are still on the walls. The light still comes in at the angle he loved. The record holds the title clear. I hold the house. Both are true. Both hold. Both will hold. The light in his photographs reminded me of something he had said once about the difference between seeing and looking. He had said, "Everyone sees. Looking is what you do when you pay attention to what you are seeing." I had looked at the IRS notice. I had looked at the lien. I had looked at the deed. I had looked at the statute. I had paid attention to what I was reading rather than to what the letter had claimed I was dealing with. The difference between seeing and looking had been the difference between paying the IRS and discharging the lien. I had looked. I had found the answer in the record. The record always has it for those who look, matters, because federal tax liens are creatures of federal law, but they operate against property interests that are defined by state law. The joint tenancy, the survivorship right, the original deed language, the Affidavit of Surviving Joint Tenant. These are all governed by Ohio law. The federal tax lien statute, the attachment rules, the case law about survivorship and lien termination, these are federal. An attorney who knows only the state property law might not know the federal lien framework. An attorney who knows only the federal lien framework might not understand the Ohio joint tenancy rules well enough to apply them correctly. Emeka had known both. He had confirmed my reading of the situation immediately because he had the full framework in his head. That is the attorney you need, the one who knows both the state property law and the federal overlay that applies to your specific situation. I want to say something about Delaware, Ohio, and about why we had chosen it and about what it has meant to me to have been able to stay in it. Delaware is the seat of Delaware County in central Ohio north of Columbus, and it has the specific character of a county seat that has retained its identity while accommodating the residential growth that proximity to Columbus produced over the decades. The downtown has the brick commercial buildings and the courthouse square that Ohio County seats tend to have, and there is a historic residential neighborhood near the downtown that has the dense canopy and the house styles of an older development pattern. The east side neighborhoods where our house is located develop later and have the more open character of the 1970s and 80s suburban development, but with the mature landscaping that time produces. Delaware also has Ohio Wesleyan University in the center of the city, which gives it the specific intellectual texture that a small liberal arts university gives to a medium-sized Midwestern city, the coffee shops and the bookstore and the farmer's market, and the general sense that the place takes ideas seriously. I had been teaching at the high school for 9 years when Terrence died. My students were there. My colleagues were there. My garden was in the side yard of the house on Birchwood Lane. The house being protected had meant not having to uproot all of this at the worst possible time. The law had protected the continuity. I had found the law by going to the recorder and reading the deed and reading the statute. That evening's reading had protected the continuity of my life in Delaware. I am still here.